This is Insider Itinerary. I am Seth Kaplan, as always, with you. Thank you so much for joining us for another week. We got lots to talk about. I want to start off by saying, I'm not going to say I told you so, but I kind of told you so. Last week, we were talking about, okay, let's say the shutdown ends soon, which at that point it looked like was likely to happen. How long would it take for air travel to get back to normal? And there were folks out there in some corners saying, oh, it could take weeks and that sort of thing. I said it probably won't. We talked about how this was, well, kind of like a storm, right? The way airlines were dealing with this 1,000 or so cancellations a day, sometimes 1,500. That's like a blizzard in the winter or a hurricane in the summer. And how, like those storms, it takes them, it's not something they can do immediately, get back to normal, but it doesn't take weeks either. It's usually a matter of days to get all those planes and people that are out of position back into position. And so sure enough, here we are now, just several days after the shutdown ended. The FAA has lifted those flight caps, those restrictions, and things are indeed getting mostly back to normal here, as our friends at News Nation tell us.
I'm Greg Mocker at Newark Liberty International Airport. The holiday decorations are up. People may be more willing to be in a festive mood at the airport now that the government shutdown is over.
All checked and carry-on luggage is subject to search.
Where's the luggage? How long are the lines? Did you pack everything? Airline passengers run down the regular concerns and frustrations at the airport. But there's one big worry that's off the list: delays caused by the government shutdown.
I actually heard that it was off, and we're so happy.
Penelope and her family are back home in New Jersey from a cruise. They want to keep the good vacation vibes going. Even this dog is ready to roll, perched on top of the suitcase. The Federal Aviation Administration announced on Sunday flight operations would be back to normal 6 a.m. Monday morning.
We fly out like 9 days ago, and it was a little bit of hassle. We were worried that we wouldn't catch our cruise.
Last week, the FAA ordered airlines to reduce the number of flights because air traffic controllers weren't at work. They didn't get paid during the shutdown. The federal government and airlines say cancellations hit the highest point Sunday, November 9th, when airlines cut more than 2,900 flights. Ryan Van Landingham arrived at Newark Liberty International Airport with his guitar and chill attitude.
I think everyone is relieved that Thanksgiving can happen. Catching reflections of water, listen to songs.
He dropped off his bandmate at Newark first thing Monday.
You know, for the shutdown to be throwing all of that into jeopardy, it was very stressful.
Air traffic controllers have to keep a rhythm too. As more come back to work, more planes can be in the air. By Sunday, staffing triggered slowdowns were down to 1. It was 81 on November 8th.
It really just added an extra headache that we didn't need. And so realizing, over this weekend that things were going to be okay, really it changed the whole mood of everything going on.
The FAA will refocus efforts on hiring more air traffic controllers. Those shortages continue and could slow things down into the coming new year. At Newark Liberty International Airport, I'm Greg Mocker.
And from Newark, which is one of the country's busiest airports, we turn our attention to what once was one of the country's busiest airports. It's not anymore, but it does have a brand new terminal. I am talking about Pittsburgh. And let me start by showing you the final operations. That's a pilot we've just gotten off the last flight ever at the old terminal. These are scenes of that old terminal in Pittsburgh where operations wound down Monday night. That was a final flight there. Last international flight was on British Airways. And then come Tuesday morning, look at this gleaming new terminal. These photos from right before the terminal opened. They are now, I can tell you, full of passengers. And what's interesting about this is you think about, new airport terminals must mean expansion, right? Ability to have new flights. Look at how gorgeous that looks indeed. Well, in Pittsburgh's case, it's a more complicated story because actually the airport is far less busy than it once was. The airport, as it has existed, was designed as a really busy hub for what was called U.S. Air, then U.S. Airways, which eventually became part of American. Back in the 1990s, I remember sitting there in 1997 about to board a flight to Los Angeles, And across the hall were flights going to London and Paris and Frankfurt. And I mean, now you're lucky if you can get a nonstop flight to certain cities in the US. Pittsburgh kind of became redundant as a hub thanks to economic problems the airlines had, also consolidation. There just aren't as many airlines. They don't need as many hubs as they used to. Now that US Airways and American aren't two separate airlines, right? Chicago, a bigger city, has a hub that serves that purpose for American. And so what you had was this kind of overbuilt airport, which had been built for one purpose, and it was a really good connecting hub, but it actually wasn't as convenient as it could have been for local passengers. They kind of had to go a long way. If you lived in Pittsburgh to catch a flight, you had to take this train out to your gates. Well, now they have shrunk the airport down to the size that kind of meets the number of flights that are there now, and they've built facilities that make more sense for local passengers. So it's now more convenient to catch a flight if you're going into or out of Pittsburgh, and they just don't have to worry about accommodating those big hub operations, for better or worse, that are just not there and are unlikely to come back anytime soon. So Pittsburgh, congratulations on their brand new terminal, which is not the first time, by the way. There are other cities that have done this where a new terminal doesn't necessarily mean growth. It means adapting to new realities. I want to tell you about Allegiant Airlines, which has announced 30 new routes. This is a rather successful airline, and water cannon salutes like this one, you're going to see them a lot of other places coming up soon, including 4 all new airports for Allegiant, or at least airports where it either has never flown or hasn't flown in a really long time. From tiny airports like Trenton, New Jersey, to giant airports like Philadelphia, not far from Trenton, and all kinds of airports in between. Columbia, Missouri is one. You're going to see more of these Allegiant flights. In many other cases, just connecting dots that already exist on Allegiant's route map with each other. And we are going to talk a lot more about Allegiant, why it's doing this, how it is doing as an airline, coming up in the second part of Insider Itinerary. First, though, I want to talk about, with the shutdown behind us, thankfully, now it's time for Thanksgiving travel. We heard Greg Mocker there a few minutes ago tell us about how now it's just kind of back to the usual stuff that you deal with when you go to the airport, thinking about what you packed and making your flight on time, assuming it's going to take off on time, which is now a better bet than it was during the shutdown. So what about that? How are things looking as Thanksgiving approaches? That is the subject of this report.
Whether you're avoiding baggage claim and buckling up, or braving the baggage of family drama, Thanksgiving travel plans appear to be hot. According to AAA's annual forecast, they say 82 million people will travel at least 50 miles from home from the Tuesday before Turkey Day to the Monday thereafter. 1.3 million more people to drive compared to last Thanksgiving.
Despite obviously there being some economic uncertainty, there are some positive factors in that gas prices are lower, things like that. And what we've seen in the past is people do what they want to do.
More than 73 million people are slated to travel by car, 6 million to hit the skies.
I'll eat lots of turkey and watch football.
Tanya is ready to host her family in Hagerstown, Maryland, and hopes people aren't spooked by the latest flight disruptions from the government shutdown.
Oh, I would hope not, because I would say it was flawless for us. Good. We had no trouble whatsoever.
Though University of Maryland student Nicholas Matthew would not be shocked if people's plans did change lately.
I think things are slowly reopening, but yeah, it will definitely impact people's decisions to want to go travel again and want to be out in the airports in such a busy time.
Tucker Mountain is hitting the road to Tennessee after being concerned about lingering flight disruptions. Did you even consider flying?
I did before the government opened back up, but I'd already booked a car.
So there you see what is lingering impact of the shutdown, that there were people who made their decisions when things were looking uncertain and are now sticking with those plans as they had made them. Well, coming up next in Insider Itinerary, mentioned Allegiant. We're going to talk more about Allegiant, also more about people who are paying more but happy to do it because they're getting more when they fly. A certain segment of the market, it's bigger than it used to be. Premium leisure travelers, that and more coming up on Insider Itinerary. Welcome back to Insider Itinerary. Seth Kaplan with you, joined now by Jay Shabbat of Airline Weekly. Jay, thanks so much for being back on the show.
Thank you,
You're,
Seth. Thanks for having me.
yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you did. This is what happens when you do a good job, like you did last time, then you get stuck doing this again. So maybe you'll be terrible today, and then we won't bother you again.
I'm always happy to get re-invited to the party, so I'm gonna do my best to do a good job.
Thanks so much. Hey, Jay, I want to start with something we've talked about on the show. Allegiant Airlines, and we've talked about them a lot in past episodes, is a rather successful airline that flies almost all leisure passengers, and I know we want to talk later about business passengers with and other kinds of premium demand and that sort of thing. But in this case, it's people who all have one thing in common. They're almost all of them anyway. They're going on vacation somewhere. They're going to see their families from lots of small and mid-sized cities to big destinations. Anyway, they announced dozens of new routes, 30 new routes, and they're entering four new cities. In some cases, entirely new. In other cases, cities that they maybe served a long time ago. But places as small as Trenton, New Jersey, to as
My
big
home
as
airport.
exactly your home airport. You're right there in sort of halfway between Trenton and Princeton. So as small as Trenton, and just right up the road, down the road from Trenton, as big as Philadelphia International, and
Another
everything
another one of my home airports.
exactly, and everything in between. What else did they have? Uh, Columbia, Missouri, where Mizzou is, for example, and La Crosse, Wisconsin's the other new airport. But then connecting lots of other dots that already existed, adding flights from Rochester, New York, to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for example, one of the new markets. Sadly for me, here in Harrisburg, where we have a lot of Allegiant service, no new dots from Harrisburg, but they already do a lot here. Anyway, let's talk about that. So this is an airline that continues doing rather well, at least compared to some of the ones we've seen in the headlines. Spirit, obviously, in bankruptcy, restructuring, and so forth. What can you tell us about Allegiant, and where they've come from, and where they're heading next?
Sure, yeah. So Legion, as you suggested, they are doing rather well, particularly for a low-cost carrier in the United States right now, because there are four big ones that are struggling badly. And those you mentioned, Spirit, but also Frontier, which is a very Spirit-like carrier, same business model, similar business model.
And
And
one, just to interrupt you for a second, one that does serve Harrisburg, well, a little bit, not a lot of service, but Harrisburg to Orlando. Frontiers in that market. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
yeah,
You were
and
saying,
then
yeah, Frontier.
yeah, and then you have Southwest and JetBlue are the other ones that have been struggling. So Allegiant's kind of been able to avoid that. Having said that, they're not performing quite as well as they were pre-pandemic. 2018, 2019, even going back further than that, they were kind of one of the profit superstars globally. I mean, they're a relatively small airline. They're not really much known outside the United States, but they were a very, very, very profitable airline. Now they're a profitable airline without the exclamation point. But yeah, and they're getting a lot of new Boeing planes, these latest and greatest. They call them the Max jets. Um, very, very commonly flown, throughout the world. The Allegiant's getting more of those, and they need place to put them. They're always looking for, new cities, new routes, and here we are.
Yeah, they're very quick to try new markets, and also quick to pull out of markets when they don't work. I mean, so we can say almost certainly that of these 30 new markets that they're starting, not all 30 of them will work. A year from now, some small number of those markets will not be there. We just don't know which ones, because obviously, if it was that easy to know that, then they wouldn't go into them in the first place.
Right. Yeah, they're that kind of airline that will do a lot of experiments. They're also unique, although more and more airlines are doing this, where they'll only schedule a flight, let's say on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, when people want to fly, and they won't fly it on a Tuesday and Wednesday, a slow day. They're very much known for if there used to be, going way back, the industry kind of economics 101 motto was, you got to keep the plane in the air because it's not going to make money on the ground. And Allegiant kind of turned that on its head and said, well, we can lose money too if there's no demand, for flying it on Tuesday and there's no demand. then we could lose money burning the fuel. So they kind of they have a little bit of a different approach. So a lot of these, and um, I'm looking at it now. A lot of these, I imagine, I don't see it in front of me, but they probably are not, every day of the week kind of service.
Right.
They'll be 2 or 3 days a week, probably.
Right. Almost nothing Allegiant does is
Almost
every
nothing.
day of the week. The closest you could come, like again, I'm a place like here, Orlando, Sanford, they might fly almost every day. But if you think about that, even almost daily service compared to other airlines that fly to this, again, using Harrisburg as the example, the American flies to Charlotte 6 or 7 times a day. Allegiant doesn't fly anywhere that many times a week, basically. And so, yeah, very different kind of model. What's interesting about Allegiant too, and I know I want to get into sort of more of the whole idea of like premium, like people who have a certain amount of money versus people who don't, two different kinds of travelers. But what's interesting about Allegiant is they are an ultra low cost airline. There's nothing fancy about flying Allegiant, but on the other hand, they actually serve people who maybe unlike Spirit typically, where pretty much the only reason somebody was flying Spirit was to save money. Very often there was another airline flying in the same market, and Spirit was cheap, and that's why they flew them. Allegiant, in many cases, is just the most convenient airline, and so they end up serving people who, in some cases, do have money and are willing to pay for something more. Is there any update on the idea of Allegiant offering sort of more premium service, a first class, that kind of thing, which I know they've spoken about?
Well, they don't do a first class, like a particular big seat, but they do have a extra legroom seats now, and they say that's selling very well. They're putting it on, pretty much all their new planes. So that's an example of an airline, as an example of just pretty much any airline, whether it's a low cost carrier, a leisure carrier, a business carrier. I mean, every carrier in the world really has been chasing, few exceptions, Ryanair in Europe is, but almost every carrier in the world is chasing this premium segment, whether it's, and a lot of it, traditionally premium seats were filled by business travelers, people, my company's paying for it. And I'll go, now it's increasingly, particularly in the last couple of years, uh, huge demand for among leisure travelers paying out of their own pocket. Um, yeah, hey, I want to go to take the kids to Florida, but we're gonna do it in business class this time. Or yeah, I gotta go down to Allegiant. I have a small business it's on my debt. Still, I'm just gonna upgrade to the extra legroom seat. So Allegiant's chasing that like everybody else.
Yeah, and this is all part of a bigger thing going on in society, really, just this kind of this growing gap, income gap, wealth gap, where you have sort of something like two-thirds of the population struggling to varying degrees. People who are worried about their jobs and it's a case of just putting food on the table. If they're traveling, maybe they're not worried about that, but they are very, very cost conscious. And then kind of this one-third of people who are doing rather well and have that extra money to spend on things like something more than just basic safe transportation. Whether it's those first class. Look, even Spirit we mentioned. I mean, Spirit is now selling what they call it's the same seats as before, but they're calling it a first class product. They're offering literally you can fly first class on Spirit, which sounds like maybe an oxymoron, but it's not.
Right, right. And there's a few economic factors. I mean, you mentioned, one of them being growing inequality. I think there's a few economic factors behind the uh, increasing popularity of premium seats. One of them is just that we've seen these huge gains in the stock market. If you own a house, how your home prices have gone through the roof. That's no pun intended there. But we've had cryptocurrency values going up. So we've had a lot of we call it asset wealth appreciation. And yes, it is concentrated more on the upper end of the scale. But I should remind people that about 60, is it six, somewhere between 60 and 70% of American families own stock. So it's there it is somewhat broad. Um, other factors include, I think there's more people that have flexible work arrangements. And so this is more, you see this international, well, not even just international, but Yeah, I'm going to work in California this week, and I don't have to be back in the office on Monday, so I'm just going to make a vacation out of it. I'm going to, sit in business class. There's that. There's also just this huge bulge of retired people. Just demographically, we just have a very large number of retired people with a lot of time. They have savings, also benefiting from asset price appreciation. They have stocks that they've been buying their whole lives, so they've been buying a lot of these premium seats as well. So yeah, a lot of factors driving it. And there's also, I think, just some consumer preference behind it too, some changes in consumer preference. I think we see, especially younger generations, um, less interested in spending their money on a fancy car. I'd rather, spend money on a fancy airline seat and a fancy hotel in Paris so that I could take a picture and post it on Instagram and show all my friends and be cool. And I think there's some consumer preference changes and evolution as well. So a lot of factors.
Yeah, and that's a great point. That even in terms of sort of conspicuous consumption, right? Because we think about it as like, if people don't care about material, they care about stuff. Then maybe don't care what people think. But even if you care what people think nowadays, what people think has more to do with exactly the trip than the fast car you drive up on. So that's an important point too. So let me ask you this. You
If I'm
mentioned
going
some.
to in a
Yeah.
couple weeks, I'm going to be in some very dull Chicago suburb, but I'm going to take a picture in a very I don't know. I'm going to make myself look cool with a cool background. You're going to be jealous.
Well, there you go, and so right because
Chicago
of
in
it.
January, by the way.
Exactly, but just frame it in a way that right we can't always see as the bean, and who knows, it could be
I'll
all
know that it's snowing and windy and
who knows?
30
Yeah,
degrees.
exactly.
So.
Exactly. Just have a nice drink in my hand at whatever rooftop bar I'm at. Yeah, that's absolutely, that is conspicuous consumption nowadays. So now let me ask you this: you mentioned crypto values and stock market values and all of that, and those are things that obviously for years have been going mostly up. Uh, been wobbly, some of these things more recently. So I guess the question is, how much of these changes that you've talked about, where now these premium seats are filled with, in some cases, people spending their own money, not just their employer's money. Um, how much of that is a structural change, and how much of that is, just maybe, if not a bubble, then something that could go back the other way, where all of a sudden, if you're airlines like Delta and United that have been profiting so much from that trend, all of a sudden maybe that goes in reverse, and that starts to be a liability rather than an asset.
That's the great debate. That's the big giant question that's going to shape the health of the airline industry in 2026. Is you said it perfectly. Is the premium boom that we've experienced the last, let's call it 4 years, is it structural or is it cyclical? Structural meaning that something about the world has changed. People now are just different. They're going to fly premium no matter what. Cyclical being, well, maybe it's just been that way for the past couple of years because the economy has been a certain way and stock market has behaved in a certain way. What if there is a recession? What if there is a stock market bust? What if there is you know, this a big, spike in unemployment? Does that premium preference still hold? You'd have to think that it doesn't, but I could be wrong. I mean, maybe some of these retired people I talk about are shielded from that. Maybe just, yeah, the people that are going to travel are just, they've decided they're going to do it in premium class, and that's going to continue. So that's kind of the big great debate. I should just go take a step back. I mentioned how most of these low cost carriers struggling in the past couple of years. And one big reason why is because they don't have the same degree of premium products and services to sell into this booming market like your Deltas, like your Americans, like Uniteds. So that's a big, in a little bit of a sense, they might be hoping that it goes back to the old way, that people are maybe a little bit more price sensitive in the future so that they'd be, more inclined to go for that just give me the cheapest seats kind of attitude. Now, everything I they are these carriers are, as I mentioned, Allegiant, extra legroom seats. Spirit, you mentioned it, first class seats. Frontier, first class seats. Southwest, there's talk now that they might open lounges. JetBlue is opening lounges. So it would be a little bit inconvenient if they were, pushing in that direction and suddenly it all fell apart. It's like, whoops, we took a step in the wrong direction. So, but nobody knows.
Nobody knows, and no question that the last time things were really bad in the world, aside from the pandemic, which is a little bit different, obviously it was awful for the airline industry briefly, but we're just there was sort of just economic melee unrelated to the pandemic was like a 2009. And if we think back to then, those kinds of airlines did really, really well.
Yeah.
And it was the premium oriented airlines that struggled. So we'll see. I mean, this is what makes watching this industry fun. Just these questions that nobody knows the answer to. We know there's going to be a downturn here at some point, whether we're in the beginning of it now or it's sometime in the future.
Economists have a saying that expansions don't die of old age. We've had it's been a while since there's been a non-pandemic recession, traditional run of the mill recession. You mentioned it, 2008-09. And so there's no, just because it's been a while doesn't mean that there's one imminent. I mean, there are a couple things I want to say. I'm stealing this from, I wish I knew the economist's name, but I've heard people talk about the three A's that are kind of driving the economy right now. So one is, the artificial intelligence boom, all this, enormous hundreds of billions of dollars that are being invested in these data centers that enhance computing power to create these, wonderful new AI models that may or may not revolutionize, the way we do business and productivity and all that. Question mark. The other two A's, one being the asset price appreciation that I mentioned before, and then the third A would be the affluent consumers. Just there's been a lot of spending. If you listen to companies speak nowadays, and that's something in my job I do a lot of, listening to earnings calls, not just of airlines, but also just companies. I try to get a sample of companies around the economy, and you'll hear it over and over. Demand looks really strong among our upper income consumers, but people below a certain income threshold, it's kind of getting dicey there, where people are worried about their jobs. And you can see this even in companies like, think about the dollar stores, Dollar General. They're feeling it more than, say, a Delta, which very much caters to the premium traveler. So you mentioned it earlier. There's kind of two economies happening right now. Some people call it the K-shaped economy.
Right. The K. In other words, yeah. The K. This is the getting the rich getting richer, or the high income, whatever you want to call it, getting rid. And then the others, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jay, thank you so much for all your insight. I think if your goal today was to do poorly so that I don't bother you again to ask you to come on some future day, you've failed miserably. Really appreciate your time.
I appreciate that roundabout compliment. Yes,
Yeah, no,
yeah, very much
it
complimented. Thank you, and I look forward to you don't have to twist my arms to talk about air. There's four things that I love to talk about. You know this, Seth, because we've been friends a long time. Airlines, railroads, the economy. What's the fourth
baseball.
thing? Baseball. You got it.
There you go. That's Jay Shabbat of Airline Weekly, not Baseball Weekly, but that we used to be very dependent on that arriving once a week in the old world before there was all this information. Still dependent on Airline Weekly though. So I appreciate your time, Jay, and appreciate your time staying with us here. A final few thoughts and a really nice inspirational story about people who flew to Jamaica after the hurricane coming up after this. Well, finally, on Insider Itinerary, I want to turn back to something we've talked about in previous weeks. You'll recall that Hurricane Melissa that devastated Jamaica, among other places, also caused havoc in parts of Haiti, for example. But we talked about people who had a hard time getting home from Jamaica back to places like the United States. Some people it took days, others it took weeks. But now I want to talk to you about some people who've really inspired me because well, put it this way, while everybody else was running home, these people tried to go to Jamaica. They got there, and there was a good reason for it, and people there are sure glad they did, as our friends at WDAF in Kansas City tell us.
Football. This was so much fun.
That was so much fun.
Seniors at Kansas City Christian spent Monday recapping an annual missions trip that was much more than fun and games. 24 students and 6 adults landed last weekend in Jamaica's airport in Montego Bay.
Well, we got to the airport and there was no AC, so it was just like super hot and like terminals were closed and it was really crowded.
They traveled along the island's north shore to St. John's Parish.
You could definitely tell like there was a lot of damage, like roofs were blown off, trees were knocked down.
It was definitely like very like eye-opening to see it like that, and so it was definitely nice. Like the next days I was super excited to work.
And that they did. The students poured concrete and cleared trees that blocked roads, not just crossings for cars, but for livestock who couldn't get to food.
So even when we're clearing roads and chopping trees and removing dams that have, just completely covered bridges and things like that, we were always working in a way where the kids were safe.
It meant a lot to know that we were doing work that was going to help them immediately.
They also brought food, clothing, and medical supplies to distribute.
And we were able to just like talk to him for 2 hours, and it was just like really cool to see like how joyful he was during like a really terrible time for him.
Sunday?
Yeah. Sunday. Yeah. Smile a while.
Back in class Monday, they reflected on a life lesson that can't always be taught in a classroom.
I think just the perspective of being able to be a small part of something that's much bigger than you is really, really important.
Really, really important indeed. We thank those students and teachers for inspiring all of us. Some lessons there I think that we can all learn from them, and some important memories that they'll have forever. And I think it's a perfect way to bring Insider Itinerary to a close for this week. We will, as always, be back with you next week, which will be Thanksgiving week. Until then, we remind you, as always, to travel safely.